Professor Maaheen Ahmed from Ghent University is telecasting in for a video cast with Professor Latinx. And we're going to talk about Maaheen's work on monsters, kids, gender, race, and whatever else comes. Welcome, Maaheen.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
So, excuse me, I got something stuck. Share a little bit about your journey, how you came to comics, and you've got several books now that you've published, a very important book where you kind of grow concepts, new generative concepts from Umberto Eco's notion of the kind of the opera aperta, the open work. But how did you get to this place of researching and writing books on comics?
Yeah, it was a bit of a hazard, let's say. It was a bit by chance because I didn't read many comics as a kid. So when a roommate of mine at the university introduced me to Arkham Asylum, Grant Morrison's and Dave McKean's Arkham Asylum. She was reading it while we were doing our BA. And that's when I got interested because it was so different from what I'd imagined comics to be. I'd only read Tintin and Asterix before, but yeah, just briefly. I enjoyed them, but it wasn't my main reading experience. And I did a double degree that sort of focused on both literature and visual culture. And when I came to that step in life when you have to pick a doctoral project, my supervisor also just encouraged me to find something that can combine both aspects, and I didn't want to lose those worlds. And that's why I got to working on comics, but basically trying to figure out why certain artists or writers are inspired or use certain kinds of word image combinations, what those word image combinations, where they come from, what they can mean, how many different layers of references there are in them, which is, yeah, basically how do you translate an idea into words and images, and why do you select those particular words and images and combine them in that particular way? So it's a very big question, and because of that, I think the research has sort of gone into different directions or different ways of thinking about that question.
So give us in something like the openness of comics, I know you're very interested in the medium itself and genre. Can you give us some examples of some sort of discoveries made there, some comics in particular, and what it is about comics or genre, the medium itself, that can open to generative meaning or maybe even close to meaning?
Yeah, so a lot of the comics I talk about in openness, they're contemporary, and they play with the medium in different ways. So they try to break away from convention. You see that in Arkham Asylum, for instance, with Dave McKean's collages and with this figuration of Batman, which is incredible, right? Because you never really see Batman. And then obviously Grant Morrison's story that sort of portrays this very disturbed Batman, which in itself was not new for the time, but just that combination, that meeting of Morrison and McKean in that book, is striking because it's so layered, right? So the images have different references in them, and then the story itself has combined like Morrison's esoteric interests with, well, the whole Batman universe, and more and more and more. So other interesting, because openness sort of tries to bridge work across cultures. So I really like this this Finnish comic from an artist called Markku Turunen. I I think it still hasn't been translated into English, but it has been translated into French, and it's something about, it's called Death Rides By, and it's a very, yeah, it's got these characters that are monstrous and childish at the same time, and I didn't realize that interest in the, while I was reading it, that it's and it uses, it's in comic form, so it has panels and gutters, but it works like these old negatives sort of blurred out at the same time, so it has a different way of coloring, and a story that is very, it seems anecdotal or anecdotal, but it takes time for you to read it, and I think that's what that could be this, what I found in Openness was just that stories that offer different modes of reading them, whether that be through the visual references or whether through a certain kind of theme that is self-reflexive. Autofiction, for instance, that combines this life writing with fictional twist. And yeah, obviously this play on disjunction, right? Disjunction between what you see and what you read, and then between the different panels, much has been made of that. But I think there is something about the fragmentation in comics that sort of enables artists and writers to play with them, play with the possibilities of meaning that you can bring in comics.
You seem very interested in kind of excavating that site of kind of hesitation even between one form and another, or between one, say, ontology, say the kind of monster and the human. So tell me, yeah, let's talk about monsters, kids, and comics.
Huh. Okay, great. I see you've got some of the important books there. Yeah, so this is going in a completely different direction in a way, because it's not so theory heavy. It's basically about trying to understand where certain comics monsters, particularly certain good comics monsters, come from, and at the same time it tries to show how Romanticism sort of persists through these good comic monsters. It sort of continues in popular culture through these figures. So I start with, yeah, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Victor Hugo's The Man Who Laughed, Gwendolyn, who was the main character, who had a scar in the form of a smile, and Baudelaire's Ennui, so this very abstract monster that's quite complicated, and yeah, what he calls it, a delicate monster that you can't sort of contain in space and time, but is always sort of present, right? And it is a monster that you have to sort of grapple with, but on a mental or psychological plane. And I sort of take elements from these monsters, so this ungraspability of ennui, for instance, or this patchworked aspect of Frank hovers between being human and not being human, or wanting to be human but being denied humanity. And I try to find out how those elements are present in contemporary, well, relatively contemporary comics monsters, such as the Swamp Thing. I focus on Alan Moore's run of the Swamp Thing, and I look at Hellboy, and I look at this tetralogy by Enki Bilal, a French comics artist, writer, who also works with a very elusive monster, sort of literally, it doesn't have a form, or it keeps on changing form. And I look at James O'Barr's The Crow. And for the conclusion, I talk about my favorite thing is monster, because of it sort of captures this comics fascination for monsters, but also how comics themselves talk about their own history in a way and sort of refigure it. And part of the book is also about tracing the visualization of monsters from Romanticism until today. So I also look at Goya's images of monsters and Blake's discussion of monsters. And that too is something you find in my favorite thing is Monsters, where Karen is always looking at these works of both fine art but also comics themselves, and she sort of interacts with them in the story, and she also sort of plays out the genre of horror comics and detective comics while creating this visual space as well.
Right. Yeah.
So,
it's very. My favorite thing is Monsters is a kind of education of the senses in and through art, but art coming from everywhere, right?
Yeah. That's what I love about it, how she sort of just combines visual impulses from, well, yeah, left, right, and center, and it works, right? Because everything sort of is relevant in its space and if it in its context.
What do you do? How do you read Hellboy? Both as a kind of, yeah, tell me, how do you read Hellboy according to your kind of approach and concepts?
So there's I look at Hellboy from the lens of a nostalgia for these long forgotten worlds, because as Buchman said, Hellboy is a very bookish comic, right? Because it's always about other fairy tales, transposing other fairy tales, myths, legends, whatever, into this comics world. So one aspect is the nostalgic one, because Hellboy's world, towards the end, Hellboy is always trying to save a world that's disappearing. We have that sense even in the beginning, right? It's this paranormal space that is increasingly limited, and you have these paranormal creatures sort of struggling to maintain their space, and that's why they sort of entrench into the human space. But there's also the element of the quest. So the romantic hero, as theorized in literature, is always on this quest to get somewhere, or a quest for that should ideally culminate in a wholesome, holistic, better self-understanding of their place in the world, right? And Hellboy's quest is about that, about understanding himself as a monster fighting for humans, or trying to protect humans, and trying to sort of understand where he stands. But it's a hopeless quest from the beginning, right? So it's a doomed quest. And on top of that, there's always the solitude of the protagonist. And that is also something that monsters, especially the comics monsters I talk about, they inevitably embody that solitude, because, well, they're monsters, and they're good monsters, so they're destined to be alone. And yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Tell us a little bit about your discoveries, your work on race and gender in comics. And I'm thinking in particular of the wonderful chapter that you have in the forthcoming Gender and Sexuality in Comics.
Yeah. So this is this goes on a different, tangent almost, but it's linked in the sense that I try to follow visual stereotypes, but I focused on race and how race has been stereotyped in general, so how Black people have been portrayed in print and popular culture, and how that has been transferred onto comics and then sort of mainstreamed. I think my problem was, it's a very familiar problem, right? These racial caricatures, because they're usually just dismissed as being caricatures, and they're supposed to be acceptable because they're just comics, or they're made to entertain or provide humor or be satirical. But I really feel like these racial caricatures are deeply harmful, and that they really do need to be unpacked and criticized and rethought, right? Because they don't come from nowhere. They come from a whole, and that's what I try to show in this chapter. They come from a whole history of reducing a certain community or ethnicity or whatever. And I introduced this concept of soft hate because I think when such stereotypes are at work at comics, what they do is they enact this kind of hate that seems innocuous and innocent and unharmful, but that is really very pernicious, because it's precisely because it seems innocent or just something that's made to entertain or to distract. And for that, I turn to Sarah Emmett's concept of stickiness and how certain emotions get stuck to images and bodies, and how the emotions themselves have a certain history, that they come from somewhere and they have a certain context. And I try to show how, look, the representation of Black boys and girls in comics is sort of layered with this hate that is almost consistent, barring a few examples. So we have caricatures, say, Out Cold Spoil Little Mouse, and Ebony White, for instance. And it's only until very recently that you have something like Boondocks that sort of undoes that kind of caricature completely. It walks away from it, but also criticizes it at the same time in its jokes. And you have Joan Osborne's Patty Joe comics that, well, I'd really like to see more work on. But that was
really important, exciting areas that we need to continue working on, right? Children in comics. So this is, I think, another area that we really need a lot more work on. And I know this is where you are doing a lot of work. Share with us some of your sort of discoveries here.
So this is coming from a project that we'll talk about later. So this chapter is, as it announces, it's about showing how children in comics somehow can be positioned between trying to educate while trying to entertain at the same time, and how this kind of how the comics are often a tussle between education and entertainment. And again, I try to go back to the older comics from the late 1900s, say, like The Yellow Kid, and a British comics magazine that started in 1938 called the Beano. And I look at a few kids from that as well. And I try to draw a connection to the childishness of the style, or how children and humor have been connected. There's a French psychologist called Nelly Forhan, and she talks about how children and comics have childish laughter has been linked to either social critique on one hand, but also a certain kind of entertaining or dismissive logic on the other. But it's a kind of space that is that allows you to do both. And I try to bring that back to children in comics by looking at how a lot of comics children got away with doing very naughty things. Sometimes they were punished, sometimes they were not. But this varied according to, say, that the audience, whether the comic was completely for children or adults. And I think that's yeah, and that they have a certain kind of agency as well. That is because I think the fascinating aspect of children in comics is that they're obviously not very realistic representations of children, right? So they have a lot more freedom than ordinary children would ever have, but they're also sometimes caught up in these very violent situations, which is what you see in, say, even in these Victorian comic strips. The Victorian comic strip that we have, which is Max and Moritz, which in turn criticizes Struwwelpeter. That was an earlier illustrated book for children, sort of, which was surprisingly very gruesome for and something that you would not expect for its time, right? So it sort of combined this idea of educating children while entertaining them through providing them with these very shocking images. So the kids, there's blood. If there's someone who mocks the three kids who mock a black kid, and they're sort of dipped in ink for that's sort of stuck to their bodies forever. So every action in Struwwelpeter has this very drastic consequence, and that continues in Max and Moritz as well, where the kids at the end are just flattened, right? They're flattened and then ground into duck feed, and then the very final image shows ducks eating up the little crumbs sort of left. But there, Bush was sort of took it to an extreme, and there he was mocking the Struwwelpeter stories in a way, but that kind of combination of violence and punishment, and at the same time also suggesting what kids should do and should not do, is constantly present in these the earlier comic strips, I find. And yeah, that's what I try to sort of talk about in this chapter and lay the ground for.
So I know we're going to kind of get to the Kids in Comics big project that you're doing right now, the Big Data project. But can you share with us how you bring some of this, your research, your interests, your passions, into your classrooms, into the teaching of comics?
Well, for the moment, I have a research position, so I don't teach very much.
Lucky for you. Can we all sign up for that?
Yeah, I did realize that when you don't have teaching, there's no structure, and then one has a tendency to assume one can do a lot more than one really can, and so it has that side to it. But and plus, obviously, the interaction with students is absent, right? Research is lonely business.
Yes.
But when I did. When I did teach comics, they were usually sort of incorporated into literature courses. I find myself in a literature department right now. And so we looked at them through the lens of intermediality and how they can sort of be contextualized in a broader context of media interactions. So the most obvious things were adaptations, but also comics novels such as Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, and how that sort of interacts with the superhero genres. And obviously Watchmen, which is a big favorite because of its rewriting of the superhero genre, and Mouse because of its reworking of trauma. It matters because I think the students really appreciated this contemporary element, because, well, this breaking away from what literature is or can be, but also trying to understand how all media sort of interact with one another. They're not hermetic holes, or they're not self-contained, and it's nice to sort of try and figure out how fluid the boundaries really are between media. So it was very easy to get students interested, and but I also found that some of them, because they were literature students, they're quite hesitant about dealing with images. So it was also nice to try and break that barrier regarding the image and talking about the image.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. So yeah, tell us about your comics project there and what you're discovering, what your methods are. Yeah, just all of the above.
Huh. Okay, great. So this is a 5-year project that involves several researchers. I think it will be a total of 5 people eventually. Right now, we're only the 3 other people besides me. So it started in fall 2018, and we hopefully can keep on going until 2023. And the idea was to create a kind of intercultural history of comics through looking at children in European comics since 1865, which is the year that Max and Moritz was published. And so the tenet was that the figure of the child is a very complex figure anyway, but it's also something that changes a lot through time and through modernity, with all the scientific and technological changes, but also the many far-reaching events, right? The World Wars, the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, and so on. And another element was trying to use use expertise from 2 fields, so childhood studies on one hand and comic studies on the other. I find that these fields don't talk too much to each other, and it would make more sense that they do. Of course, now we have some great work out there by Lara Sagisag, Christina Meyer, Michelle Ann Abed, who's very close to you. And so there is research out there on children in comics, but it hasn't been seen, or they haven't been seen in this from a broader historical perspective. And we're trying to, we're still only starting. So we've got Donna Purcell, who's doing a PhD project on the Beanos, a British comics magazine, and she's trying to see how to read these comics children. Then we've got Eva van der Wiele, who's working on 2 major Italian and Spanish magazines that started a little before the Beanos in the early 1900s. And we've got Benoit Crucifix recently. He's going to talk about, who's going to work on how the connections between children's drawings and comics. So the project has these 2 elements. It's trying to construct or offer history through following children in comics, but it's also trying to interrogate the notions of childishness that are attached to comics, and sort of reconsider them through a critical angle, because there's this element of the childishness of the style, right? And then this childish lack of logic or humor that can be, that I find quite exciting to unpack. And we're also very interested in formats, so how formats can change or have an impact on the kinds of child characters that are portrayed, which formats are more important at which period and which context. So, yeah.
So the comic strip versus the comic book versus the comic that appears in a magazine versus and
the graphic novel child.
There is a moment in that you were talking about kind of intermedial, intermodal, transmodal modes, and there's with Winsor McKay and others, of course, there was a moment when you had the comic strip and the animated sort of film working together, growing together, right?
Yeah.
Exciting. And so where is for you the kind of heartbeat of comics, comic studies, comics today?
I think it's everywhere, right? What's fascinating for me is that comic studies has really grown this exponential rate, right? When I started my PhD, there wasn't half as much out there. I don't know, a tenth of the material out there, and it's been diversifying in a wonderful way, right? So there is obviously this interest in diversity with these new characters and these. There's a diversification of production on one hand, but a diversification of research as well. So we've moved away from literary studies departments. We've got colleagues from visual studies, communication studies, whatnot, and they come up with different kinds of questions. And all of that is sort of interacting with each other. So it's multidisciplinary, and I think that's part of its life force in a way. And comics production is just, it's hard to grasp, right? Because you have everything. You can find this massive variety of mainstream and alternative and artsy and literary comics. And that's, I guess, diversity involves many.
Yeah, no, exciting. If I know you are kind of immersed in all sorts of comics, children's comics right now for your big comics project, but is there a comic that you have on your nightstand or on your kind of in your living room right now that you're just enjoying to enjoy?
I actually have, my favorite thing is MONSTROUS. which I'm really enjoying, reading it for the, I don't know, upteenth time.
Right, I know, I love that book too. Yeah, absolutely. It's the comic. It's the comic that keeps on giving and giving and giving, right?
Yeah. Otherwise, I have a French comic that is wordless. It came out. It came out a few years ago. Right now, it's by Pascal Maté, Les Téteurs. It's it's about the title is after these tadpoles that you also get in the form of you have sweets. These, I think Haribo makes them as well. So you have these tadpole sweets, and it's named after that. And it's very distinct. And I don't have a copy with me to show you, but I can send you an image later on. It's one of those rare comics that has a child, the author, the artist himself, but it's full of just very happy memories. There's nothing traumatic in it. It's just very peaceful, and it works.
Yeah, we need joy right now. Lots of joy and peacefulness and happiness, right?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Maaheen Ahmed from Ghent University, author of many books and undergoing this tremendous comics studies, big data project with children and comics. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks a lot.